So I'll start by asking you, you had a housing announcement today. So will you talk a little bit about it, since I don't know as much about it?
No, of course, Dean. And you know, it's a really exciting, I mean, today is actually a very powerful day, not just for Baltimore, but for the state of Maryland. Because when we came on board, we said that we were focused on making sure that we are going to center our work on accountability and also center our work on affordability. There's an affordability crisis that's taking place, specifically around housing. And so when a lot of people said, you know, don't touch housing and housing is complicated, this last legislative session, we ended up passing the most comprehensive and aggressive housing package in the history of the state of Maryland. And today, which we're really excited about, and we'll talk more about it if you like, but today, we just followed it up with an executive order. And I just signed an executive order called Reinvest Baltimore, where we're focused on the vacant houses within Baltimore, where there are currently about 13,000 vacant homes within the city of Baltimore. With this new strategy and new investments that the state is now making, where we're now going to work in partnership with the city of Baltimore, work in partnership with the private sector and philanthropy, where we are going to remove the city of 5,000 vacant homes over the next 5 years on a pathway of eliminating the vacant problem within the city of Baltimore. And so we're excited because partnership produces progress in this work, and Baltimore needed a partner in Annapolis. And we're just really excited and proud that our administration can serve as the partner that Baltimore needs to be able to address this issue.
So let me ask you, I'm going to come back to Housing Summit, and also come back to the fentanyl discussion we just had, but those are all really big, ambitious goals, and you laid them out during your campaign. I mean, I've made a list of, you know, tackling child poverty, reshaping the state's economy, reducing the racial wealth gap, dealing with affordable housing, and then here's what happens to governors. Boom. You have to cut $150 million from the budget. You're facing a budget deficit that I think is going to be nearly $2 billion a year. So how are you going to do all that?
Well, yeah,
can you do all that?
Yes, and actually I'm really proud, because I think if you look at all those things that you just mentioned, that the state has already started making a dent on each and every one of them. I think one thing people are realizing from our administration is, you know, if we said it, we meant it. And the things that we said we were going to focus on are the things we've been able to focus on. And being able to be bold and be fiscally disciplined do not have to be mutually exclusive ideas. You can do both. But you know, what we walked into and the challenge that we walked into, it was real. I mean, we walked into a multi-billion-dollar structural deficit. We walked into a situation where we saw how Maryland's GDP, Maryland's economy, was basically growing over the past 7 years prior to us coming on board, grew by 3%. The average state in this country grew by 11. So Maryland was just deeply and drastically falling behind other states. The thing that Maryland was not falling behind was our budget kept growing. Our budget increased by 70% during that time period. And so when you have a growing budget, but you have flat revenues, that's what creates the gap. That's the structural deficit that we had to walk into. And so there's a few things that we said that we're going to do. When we talk about being, you know, when we talked about being bold, it meant you have to get people back into the workforce. So we made historic investments in childcare, because if you want to get people back into the workforce, particularly young parents and particularly women, you must invest in childcare. And so we made the largest investment in childcare in the state's history. We said we've got to get more people trained up and focus on apprenticeship programs and trade programs. We have now quadrupled the amount of people in apprenticeship programs and trade programs in the state of Maryland, getting more people back to work. We now have the first service year option for high school graduates in the history of the United States of America, where Maryland now is the first state that has a service year option for all of our high school graduates. The result, and we're proud, but the results have been this. You know, when I was inaugurated, Maryland was 43rd in the country in unemployment. Now, Maryland has, for the 13th straight month in a row, has amongst the lowest unemployment rates in the entire country. The unemployment rate right now in the state of Maryland is 2.9%. So we've continued to show that you can move towards creating growth. And we're now watching how the Board of Revenue estimates are actually showing, we're now showing positive turns in terms of our revenue, our projections. But at the same time, we've been able to go through 2 straight budgets that were passed, balanced budgets passed bipartisan. We didn't raise sales tax, property tax, corporate income tax, individual income tax, and we've been able to keep the largest balance in the rainy day fund of 15 of the last 20 years.
But
so you can be disciplined and be bold.
But what will you turn off? Because it's inevitable when you describe a budget deficit that's going to near $2 billion a year, and when you have I can't remember what the list was, 10 extremely ambitious proposals, which will cost money.
Yeah.
If you're going to do that in which you described as a fiscally responsible way, something's got to give. What will you turn off?
Well, I think the thing that we have to show is that fiscal discipline means actually using data, right? And frankly, so I don't come from a political background. Governor was the first office I ever ran for in my life, which is crazy, actually. But before I was governor, I was in the military. I was an Army officer. I led soldiers overseas in combat. I then I worked in Wall Street. I worked in finance. I started a business, and then I ran one of the largest poverty-fighting organizations in this country. And we ran with a real focus on data. Use data to help make the decisions that you're going to make. And frankly, when you look at the data and how Maryland's balance sheet was being utilized prior, we saw a few things. It was kind of like peanut butter. It was all kind of spread evenly.
What was some of the peanut butter?
Oh, I mean, like literally, when I looked at the balance sheet of the state of Maryland, I could not tell what Maryland prioritized, because it kind of looked like we prioritized everything and nothing at the same time, because there wasn't a decision as to what you were going to invest in. And so we made the decision that if it works, we'll invest in it. If it doesn't, I'm going to stop investing in it.
And what are some of the things that you found, just because the nitty-gritty of, it's always all elected officials have aspirational, and in fact, part of being an elected official is like coming up with a grand idea, and then you sit down and somebody lines up the books in front of you, and what are some
all
of
the
things?
interests?
Yes. And what are some of are there specific things that you are going to turn off?
Yeah. So for example, if you look at the way that we invest in certain industries, right? There are certain industries that we know that were prosperous, growing industries prior, but that do not have the same level of shelf and ROI that we had before. And so in order for us, so you take a look at certain industries in manufacturing, right? There's now new advanced manufacturing that you actually can invest in that Maryland has a unique advantage in, but that we were not prioritizing. If you look at an industry like take cyber, for example. Cyber, we are literally the home of Fort Meade. We're the home of U.S. Cyber Command. We're the home of the U.S. Naval Academy. We're the home of the NSA. We're the new home of the FBI, which we fought very hard to get. So now the FBI building's coming to the state of Maryland. With all of those assets, tell me why we are not investing in cyber and making Maryland the cyber capital of this country. But we weren't. And so in order to do that, we said, okay, how do we then look at the other industries that we are parsing? Again, talking about some of the older industries
So
of manufacturing.
what are the industries that you won't invest in as much?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to have to take a look at what becomes the ROI in certain spatial industries. So for example, you're looking at how some of the real estate builds that are taking place. What are the real estate builds that we think we can have the greatest level of return on? We have to do a better job of focusing on housing. We have to do a better job of focusing on affordable housing. We have to do a better job of focusing on green space and making places more livable and more safe and focusing on transportation assets. But to do that, it also means there's going to be certain things that aren't going to take up the same level of spatial entities. For example, as people are moving around and utilizing whether it's Ubers or Lyfts or not owning vehicles as much, and you look at the spacing that takes place in parking lots. Well, as parking lots becomes more of an antiquated thing because people are not utilizing their own individual vehicles as much or utilizing mass transit, how do you think about the future of those spaces? So these are the type of things I'm like, we have to actually think creatively and use data to make the decisions and not be so emotive in the way that we're utilizing balance sheet.
So that must be difficult, right? Because yes, using data is the sort of the business-like and even scientific way of deciding how to manage and make hard choices.
Yeah.
But now I'm asking you a question about governing. But when you hit the world of governing, if you're thinking about doing something different with parking lots,
Yeah.
I'm sure if there are any parking lot owners in the room, they're going to want to talk about that.
Yeah.
Anytime you turn anything off
Yeah.
in government, it's hard.
It is.
And even when you get to the housing, I mean the ambitious housing bills you've announced, I mean you're gonna hit people and cities and localities that are gonna say, I don't want affordable housing. Talk about the grappling of governing. Talk about governing and how you turn the sort of the big idea into like governing.
You know, it was one of the really interesting things, and I think housing is actually a really good example. When there were people who were advising us, don't touch housing, because they're like, it's really complicated. And, you know, and the way oftentimes housing works is local jurisdictions have a tremendous amount of power and authority when it comes to housing. And so literally the way it was laid out was you had local land commissioners who had more power than the governor. Local land commissioners could like stop projects. And that's just the way that the housing, you know, process works. And so I said, well, listen, I don't believe that we're going to come in and just, you know, push people over on this issue. You have to build coalitions that are big enough where everyone feels like they have a seat at the table. And so when we first said we're going to do more stuff on housing, we immediately went to places like the Maryland Municipal League and the Maryland Association of Counties, which are these organizations that really are responsible and work in coalition and connection with local jurisdictions. We were able to say, how can we get the private sector more involved inside this process and actually using leverage capital to be able to make these investments? How do we look at things like both zoning policies, but then also saying we want to create entities where we can have more renters that can turn into homeowners. And so we really built a collection and a coalition that was big enough for everyone to feel involved. The great thing that we saw with this housing package, just frankly like every bill that we passed, we've gone 26 for 26 thus far, and every bill that we've introduced has gotten passed since I've been the governor. And by the way, they've gotten passed bipartisan. We've gotten Democrat and Republican support on every single bill that we've introduced and passed. But it's because I think people recognize that we are going to build a table that's big enough that everyone has a seat. And we're going to make sure that we are going everywhere to be able to make our case. And so some of the biggest advocates that we had were actually the people who were the citizens themselves, who were then contacting their legislators and saying, we believe in the package that Governor Moore is pushing. We want you to vote yes on it. And so I think by being able to get the people involved in that process, I think we've been able to make some really good progress on it.
What's the hardest thing about governing? Because we talked about it a little bit in there. What's the hardest thing about governing? You go from, you get to describe, you know, here are the 10 things I want to do that are going to transform the state I care about.
Yeah.
And then there's governing, which means compromise, which means, you know, frankly, will the 10 things at the end of the day turn into 8 or 7 because you can't do them all? And what's the hardest thing about governing?
Yeah, you know, I'd say it's twofold. I think, you know, really making sure that you're being clear about where your values are is really important in this because, you know, listen, I'm perfectly fine on being flexible on tactics, but I'm not flexible on values. And I think you've got to make sure you hold yourself true to what are the values that you're trying to push forward and making sure that everyone is very clear on it. Because if everyone's very clear on where you are on this stuff, then the adjustments that'll be necessary to make, people will make in order to make this work happen. But I think one of the toughest things, and I know we're speaking back there, is when people said leadership is lonely, they weren't lying. It's a lonely business.
Talk about that more.
Because, you know, at the end of the day, oftentimes the decisions that you make are decisions that you alone can make. They're decisions that you alone are going to take the arrows for.
What's the hardest decision you've made so far?
Oh gosh, today?
No, period. What's the hardest decision you've had to make? And maybe even what's the decision you've had to make that you regret?
You know what's interesting? I don't regret any decision because I feel like every decision I've learned from, even bad ones, right? Because I feel like part of life is there's nothing I wish I could take back because I feel like, you know, I learned from it and I got better because of it.
But what was a bad one?
You know, one decision that I wish I would have done differently, honestly, was speaking of the Orioles. I wish we would have announced the signing of the MOU differently. Because, you know, MOUs or memorandums of understanding, they're very commonplace in the business world. They're very commonplace in the way things happen. It's basically just you're setting up the framework for the deal. And that was a really big deal to get the MOU signed with the Orioles last year, because up until that point, we were literally months away from one of the most storied franchises in all of sports essentially being homeless. And knowing that there was a real possibility we could have lost them, because it's not like there was a shortage of cities that would have loved to make them into the Nashville Orioles or the Orlando Orioles or the whatever. And when I came on board, I remember speaking with the person who's now the former head of the Maryland State Authority, and we were having a conversation, and you know, he told me, well, I think we should get a one-year deal. That's probably the best you can do. And I remember I was on the Zoom, and I said, you know, listen, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I remember as soon as I got off, I called my chief of staff, and I said, I want him gone because we're just not aligned. I'm not doing a short-term deal with them because I need certainty. Because if this is really going to be the time for the Baltimore Renaissance, there's no way you're going to have a Baltimore Renaissance or people who are going to believe in the city if one of the city's core anchors might leave in a year. I need a long-term deal. And so we said we're only going for, we're only going to go do a long-term deal. We got the team to agree to terms, which was the MOU, which was a 30-year deal. So like, we're really proud the Orioles are now playing playoff baseball when that might not have been the case, you know, just a year ago. And I don't know, I don't think I did a good enough job of articulating to people that an MOU is basically the pathway, but that the lease still has to get signed. But the MOU is basically saying the terms of the deal are now established. And so I think people are like, well, wait a second, the lease is not signed. I'm like, I understand, but the MOU is the framework that is required. And I think one thing I wish I would have explained that a little better to people.
So I got to ask you a national political question since we're, so you were one of the earliest defenders of Joe Biden when the party was starting to encourage him, when members of the party were starting to encourage him to step aside.
Yeah.
Where were you during the debate physically between Biden and Trump? And describe your reaction.
I was on a plane. I was sitting with my wife, and the team had set it up to where you had live stream to watch the debate. And I do. I mean, listen, I remember very early in that debate, it was one of the first answers. And I remember reaching over and grabbing my wife's hand and saying, oh my God. It was hard to watch.
Hard to watch because it was clear, you feel that?
Because it's clear that Joe Biden is such a good man. And I have such a deep level of respect and admiration for him as a human being. And it was just clear at that point that it was going to be very difficult for him to be able to articulate to the people of this country that he could lead for another 4 years.
Were you surprised?
I was. Because, you know, I've had the joy of working very closely with Joe Biden for these past 19 months. I could not ask for a better partner. I couldn't ask for someone who sees Maryland in the way that he does. I'm telling you, when the Key Bridge collapsed and my phone rang at 2:02 in the morning, and immediately we put the state on a state of emergency, we began to mobilize resources and mobilize state supports. The first phone call I got from the White House was at 3:30 that morning. I listened to the president give a press conference at noon that day and literally saying the words, as the governor said, we're all Maryland tough and Baltimore strong, and we are going to be with Baltimore every step of the way, and this administration has done exactly that. I could not ask for a better partner inside this work. I also knew that people around the 300 plus million people in America didn't see what I see. They didn't see a person who literally, I remember when he came to visit Baltimore after the Key Bridge, we went up in Marine One, and we were up in the helicopter going over the damage. And I was kind of like, showing things to him along with General Spellman and others, members of the Coast Guard. And hearing the President of the United States talking about things like the width of spans of pedestrian walkways. How many lanes would a new bridge have to encounter? Like, this is a guy who goes into the details of this stuff. And I knew 300 million people would not understand that.
But when you saw that moment when it was pretty clear that, it was the most historic debate collapses. I don't think there was any question about it. You were among the Democrats who still were supportive of him.
Yes.
But that was your public stance. But in your private stance, in your private position, in your private conversations, were you going, oh my God?
No, we'd met with him a couple days after that debate performance. And, when he told me, not only would he said, listen, I had a really difficult night. I acknowledge that. It wasn't a great debate performance, but I'm up for the job. And again, I know that Joe Biden, was a person who was asking details questions. The person who was on the ground in Baltimore. The person who, I've had phone conversations with him, late into the night or phone conversations early in the morning. So it's like, when he says I'm up for it, I actually had a unique perspective where I actually saw him actually doing the work. And so when he says, listen, I'm up for it, I'm like, not only am I a person, again, I'm a very big loyalty person. I do not do disloyalty. But also, I had a chance to actually see him continue to do the work. So I'm like, roger that, let's roll. But eventually you just came to the realization that, again, 300 million plus people don't get the opportunity to see what I see.
When did you come to the, and I have this, if I was a novelist, I would write this story of all of the Biden supporters who watched that scene that night, and then over a few weeks, I guess, slowly maybe came to the realization that he was going to have a difficult campaign. When did you realize that, and was there a moment when you said, he can't do this?
Well, there were very honest conversations that I had with the president.
Describe them.
Well, there were times when, when the president would say, when the president would talk about the poll numbers haven't moved and this type of thing, and it's been reported now, so it is what it is. But, where I said to him, Mr. President, I'm not sure what your pollsters are telling you, but I want to tell you what people in my church are saying. I want to tell you what people in the supermarket are saying. And I don't know what the pollsters are saying, but real people are concerned. And I think the time when I started realizing how challenging this was really going to be was when you had the president who would go up and give rallies or give detailed announcements about what policies he would do. You would have Donald Trump saying some of the craziest things that you could ever possibly imagine. And the number one story on the news was, what time does President Biden go to sleep at night? That's when I knew we've got a problem. Because if this election is going to be decided on the grounds of sleep patterns, then that's not an election you can win. Right. And that's when I thought this was going to be very challenging.
So what's going to happen in this election?
I think Vice President Kamala Harris is going to be the next president of the United States.
I think this is
the home court.
This is the home court. Right?
But listen, I do think it's and this part of this goes back to President Biden. I give him a lot of credit. I think there was two things that have been just remarkable to people. One was how quickly she was able to consolidate and lead, and just step into the moment in a really powerful way. Because you know, let's be clear. This thing could have been really chaotic. And it wasn't. And I think it wasn't for two really important reasons. One, it wasn't because we saw how Kamala Harris was so prepared for the moment and so prepared to step in and take on this leadership role. Another big reason for that, though, frankly, was Joe Biden. Because remember, the night or afternoon that Joe Biden announced he was not running for re-election, I think it was like an hour or 2 hours, something like that later, he also said, and by the way, I'm with Kamala. That shut it all down. Because let's be honest, had he not said that, had he done what no one would have questioned to say, like, you know what, I'm gonna take a few days, I'm gonna process, I'm gonna let people celebrate me for a little bit. And he could have done that. But let's be clear, that Monday morning would have been like Lord of the Flies.
Right.
I mean, you would have seen this person running for president, that running for president.
Would you have?
No, absolutely not. No, I mean,
Would you have? No.
No, not at all. I mean, look, I love my work too much, and I love what we're doing in Maryland too much, and frankly, I shared that with both the president and the vice president that night. I spoke with both of them, and even when you know, there were conversations about is there something else that I might be interested in doing with Kamala Harris, I said I'm very clear. I have zero intention of leaving. I love being the governor of Maryland. This is going to be Maryland's decade, and I plan on being its leader to make it happen. But I just think about what that could have been had there not been that measure of consolidation around the vice president. It could have been really bad. Right. And frankly, I think would have truly handed the election to someone who does not deserve to win in November.
So I have one more question, because we're way over time. But
oh, sorry.
And it relates to some of the every elected official, especially an elected official who rose so quickly and has such high poll numbers as you. Everybody's got a narrative that has a negative tinge to it. Here's yours, that I, just from reading a lot. Charismatic, identifies the biggest problems, big ideas, but hasn't governed yet for a long time. So is he going to be able to pull off? Is it too much? What's the cliche? Sizzle, not enough steak. Huh. Is it too much? Are you going to do these 10 giant things, or are you a guy who will struggle to actually meet your loftiest goals?
I mean, I'd say that when I first became the governor, Maryland, over the 8 years prior, had gone over an 8-year period where the homicide rate in the state of Maryland had nearly doubled, where in Baltimore City had 300 plus homicides for 8 straight years before I became the governor. Since I've become the governor, Maryland has had amongst the fastest drops in homicides and violent crime in the entire country. The last time the homicide rate was this low in Baltimore City, I wasn't born yet. I would say that we actually have now, when you look at our unemployment rate, not just some of the fastest drops in unemployment, but actually Maryland being able to move forward in new industries and new industries of growth, that we now have a state that is actually investing in transportation assets and moving people from where they live to where they work and where they live to where they worship. That we have, that we now have an education system that is truly focusing on things like making students not just employees but employers. That Maryland is now the first state in the country that has a pathway for free dental care and health care for members of our National Guard, because no one should wear the uniform of this country and have to worry about their dental care. And now we have other states who are following the same model. Maryland is now the first state in the country that now has a service year option for all of our high school graduates. The only thing that New York, Utah, and soon to be Delaware have is that they're actually incorporating into their states as well, that Maryland actually led the charge to make that happen. That we're now a state that has made historic investments in everything from child care. We made the earned income tax credit, we've expanded it. We made the child tax credit permanent in the state of Maryland, that we've had some of the steepest drops within child poverty, and actually being able to address the issue of the racial wealth gap. So I guess my answer to them would be, what steak are you looking for?
Thank you. Thank you.